All right, that sounds good. I guess we can start. Okay, so all right, folks, welcome to this talk on brief history of Islamic science fiction. So my name is Muhammad Aurangzeb Ahmed. So a few things about my background. So I'm a research scientist at a healthcare AI company, mainly based in Seattle, visiting faculty at University of Washington. So I mainly focus in my, I guess, day work. So mainly focused on AI and machine learning. And then besides that, also also dabble in science fiction and fantasy. So I've been, ever since my undergrad days, so that's since 2005, I've been running this website, Islam and Science Fiction Project. So it's basically a compendium of resources of fiction, so novels, short stories, movies, and whatnot, which is either inspired from Islamic cultures or has Muslim characters. So basically Islam and more in the cultural and civilizational sense, and not necessarily in religious sense. Okay. So with that disclaimer, so let me just start. So since we're talking about history and science fiction, if you look at the larger context of human history, science fiction is not that very long, but we can talk about the antecedents to science fiction, or what certain people call proto-science fiction, or bleeding into fantasy in general. So if you look at the geographical regions which now constitute the Islamic world or the Muslim world, we're talking about the Middle East, Central Asia, and whatnot. So we have a rich history of fantasy traditions, so things like the Arabian Nights, which was originally actually written in the Persian language. And then from South Asia, we have a lesser known work of fiction known as Tlism Hoshruba, or which in English would be roughly translated as mind-blowing magic. It's supposed to be the largest work of fantasy ever written. It only has 100,000 pages, and we can be rest assured that nobody has read it. My father had an abridged version, and the abridged version had 100 volumes of, I think, 200 or 250 pages each, something like that. So yeah. So basically the idea being that there's a long history of that. If we specifically focus on science fiction elements, then in the Arabian Nights, so we have stories which we can recognize, which have science fiction elements. So we have robot horses, we have robot sailors, interplanetary travel, using machines. So it's important to mention that it's not because of magic, but it's because of machine. All of these things are happening. And then there's the question about how can we define a purely science fiction work of literature? So there are different ways to define that. There's dispute regarding what can be said to be science fiction. So by some definitions, one of the earliest works, science fiction, was written by actually written by an Arab Muslim philosopher / physician, Ibn al-Nafis. And so the story it's set in this world. It's about this fetal child who is spontaneously generated on a cave in an island, and then by reasoning alone, he tries to deduce how the world works. And then later on, he meets people, and then it turns out that many of the ideas that he comes up independently accord well with revealed religion. So basically, Ibn al-Nafis is trying to advocate this idea of primacy of reason. Okay, So, so that was I would say, the distant past. So now, before moving on to more contemporary stuff, so one thing that I would like to emphasize is that just a few things to disambiguate with respect to terminology. So the term Islam, so it corresponds, so it refers to a religion, but then at the same time, it refers to a culture, it refers to a civilization. Uh, so an equivalent, so but the thing is, when in general, when we talk about Islam or Islamic, we are thinking about religion. Uh, so historically, before secularization, when people talked about the West, you could use the term West and Christendom interchangeably. Uh, so an equivalent did not really exist for the Islamic world or Islamic cultures until there was one historian who was actually specialized in Islamic history, Marshall Hodgson. So he coined the term Islamicate. So it refers to the social and cultural um, ideas and relationships associated with the Islamic world and the cultural output of that historically and even contemporary. So which means that the term Islamicate refers applies even to people who are not necessarily Muslim. So, for example, if we look at Islamic history, then especially during the earlier eras, they were translators, they were philosophers who were not Muslim, but they would fall under the rubric Islamic. Uh, so, for example, the golden age of Jewish philosophy, so that happened in the Islamic lands, and so there's also this term, the Judeo-Islamic philosophy. So that would be covered under this term Islamicate. So that's just to disambiguate certain terms. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about uh, cultures and civilizations and historical eras which cover vast amounts of time. So it's not possible to talk about it comprehensively in 1 hour. So we're talking about Arab, African, Anglo-American, Persian, South Asian, and Southeast Asian worlds. So I'll only highlight some of the main things which stand out. So it's just mainly a limitation of time. Okay. So because it's not possible to talk about even all the major works of art, uh, works of fiction, let alone main works of fiction. So what I'm going to do is to emphasize two different things. And so one is uh, science fiction or science fiction like literature, which has utopian or dystopian elements. So mainly to highlight and showcase what the contemporary thinking around that time. And then beyond that, works of fiction which highlight the social currents going on in that particular time frame, in that particular region. So we'll start our journey in the 9th century. Since you're talking about utopias and dystopias. So one of the earliest, and if not the earliest, but definitely the most famous utopias written in Islamic history was by a Muslim Arab philosopher, Al-Farabi. It's known as the Virtuous City. So it's inspired from Plato's Republic. So he describes a perfect society ruled by enlightened philosophers, ruling on the basis of Islamic principles. And just like the Plato's Republic, of course, with the philosophers who are running the show. And then he also describes, well, in the absence of these philosophers, what's the next best thing? And in the absence of those people, what's the third next best thing and the fourth next best thing? And the virtuous city, also sometimes translated as the city of felicity, so it formed the basis of political discourse in the Islamic world. And it has had reverberations up to the kind of contemporary era. All right, so to make things a little more interactive, so here is a question for everyone. So because Al-Farabi's work is directly inspired from Plato's Republic, and he acknowledges it, and everybody has since then has acknowledged it. What is the one contemporary government in the world which can said to be have directly been inspired by Plato's Republic? The answer is very tricky.
Very tricky. I mean, is it Iran?
Well, it can't be a
No, no, no.
republic.
Yeah, that's true.
Are you talking about? It has to be an enlightened ruler, right?
In like Norway, maybe, I don't know.
Okay, so okay. So that's why I use the word inspired and not necessarily reflection. So so Jakar, yeah, you are absolutely correct. So it's actually uh, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So not commenting on how well it mirrors that or the form of the government, but the when Khomeini uh, was cooking up this idea of the rule of the scholars, which is like just talking about 50s and 60s. This was a very new idea in the Shia political thought. And so he refers back to Farabi, who in turn refers back to Plato. So that's a fun tidbit. Again, the results are very different, but at least the history is there.
But do you think that it was a rule of scholars when Khomeini came to power?
I mean, that's the theory. So
Well, it's not reality. I mean,
right.
these scholars committed a lot of crimes very,
Yes.
right
Yeah,
away. So what kind of
correct.
scholars are these?
Right. Yeah. So that's why I mentioned theory, not practice. Okay. All right. So now then from that, we now fast forward to early 20th century. So even in the 19th century, when I should mention that when science fiction arose in the West, so they were contemporary works of fiction regarding time travel, um, coming out of not as prominent as in the West, of course, but some works of fiction coming out of the Ottoman Empire. But because we are specifically focusing on utopias and dystopias, so one of the first one was written during the time of the British rule in Bengal by this Muslim female author, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussain. Interestingly, this book, Sultana's Dream, is also considered to be the first work of feminist science fiction. It came out in any language. And so it's a trope which may be familiar to many people now, but she was the first one to come up with it. So it just imagines this alternative world which is ruled by women, and the gender roles are reversed. So the government is run by women. So because of that, there are no wars, there's no conflict, and the world is focused on gaining knowledge and improving social conditions. And having armies is forbidden because well, that will lead to war. And society is run on the principles of non-violence. So one interesting thing about Ruqayya was that this was not just theory, but even in practical terms, she was active in fostering education amongst Muslim women in early 20th century Bengal. Okay. So now we fast forward a couple of decades. So we come to the Ottoman Empire, or rather the end of the Ottoman Empire. So this is the time when the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate had recently been deposed. So the Ataturk secularization program, so that's in full swing. And so around that time, there were some utopias, secular utopias, which were published. So the most prominent ones is the Celestial Passion. So it describes a future secular and republican Turkey where describes a world where women have many more rights, and certainly as compared to the contemporary 1930s, it describes a much more freer, much more feminist world. even as compared to the West, and describe all this fancy new technology, and religion has lost its hold over the masses, and as a result, there are a lot less problems, and everything is hunky and dory. All right. So in the same year, on the other side of the world, so mainly West Africa, there was another author, so Muhammadu Bello Karaga. He wrote a novel um, in Nigeria called Gandoki. So it can be thought of as one of the earliest example of anti-colonial sci-fi or fantasy. So it's set in an alternative world where the natives, they are involved in a struggle against British colonialism. But that said, there are jinns and other mythical creatures who are helping the natives in this struggle. All right, so before we move on, so a couple of things to emphasize. So one is that, the three examples that we have seen so far, so like Farabi's work, that's coming from earlier Islamic history. So it's an era, so we have an expanding empire, an empire which is relatively rich. And so the questions of governance and what constitutes an ideal society, so that's foremost in the mind of the intellectuals, the ruling class. In case of Ruqayya, so it's set in British India, so it's like the social concerns that she's focusing on. So that's dealing with the large female population, which is less educated, and also dealing with misogyny. In contemporary Turkey, so it's the secularization is in full swing, and then here it's a reaction against colonialism. So the point being is that we can use these works of fiction, and specifically science fiction and fantasy, to even reconstruct the political climate and how people were thinking in terms of how to respond to these changes. And then we will see that in the other works of fiction that we will see. So now we fast forward a few decades. So another really well-known work is Ali Mazruri, Trial of Christopher Okigbo. It's also considered to be one of the earliest example of what now we recognize as Afrofuturism, which has become really prominent in the last few years. So those folks who watch movies, so the Black Panther would be an example of this genre of Afrofuturism. So the novel itself, it deals with the triple heritage of Africa. So in this case, Christianity, Islam, and indigenous African and animist systems. And what the novel focuses on is just a way to synthesize these different elements of African identity, and then just the impact of colonialism and how to basically deal with the fallout of that. And around the same time when Ali Mazruri was writing this on the other side of the globe, so in the US, there was an African American writer, Jalal Mansour Nuruddin. So he was writing works of fiction, what now we would recognize as examples of urban futurism. And what is remarkable is that this is like almost 50 years ago, and he was talking about the effects of dealing with climate change and its after effects. And then also rallying against this idea that technology can solve all mankind's problem. And basically, instead of trying to create I guess one of the things that he was trying to get across is that instead of trying to create better machines, perhaps we should focus on better people, creating better people. Um, all right. So coming back to Africa, another really interesting thing that we see, and from a science fiction utopia is coming from a very unexpected source, is actually from the Muslim Brotherhood. So there were a number of these folks, these activists who were jailed in the 60s. And so while in jail, they wrote plays, they wrote novels. And so one of the most well-known of these, which was actually published in 1987, was uh, actually dealt with again with how to create an ideal government. So the premise is that it deals with a group of people who are fed up with problems on Earth, and then they take a rocket and land on Mars, and they see an alien society which is ruled by just rulers, and system of the planet is very similar to the moral and legal system of Islam. So in this case, what it basically the Mars in this case is a proxy for the system that the Brotherhood wants to enact in Egypt. And so one important call out is that it's a top-down approach to governance that they have envisioned. So not surprising coming from the Brotherhood. That said, around the same time when this novel was published in Turkey, another author, Ali Nar, so he published a semi-humorous novel, Space Farmers. So here the premise is that, so there's a group of people who land on a planet which is inhabited by people from Earth who had settled there much earlier. And so it's mainly coming from a Sufi Muslim background. And this novel imagines an ideal society which is run on Islamic principles of brotherhood and mysticism. So contrast that with what the Brotherhood was saying. So this vision is a bottom-up vision of what constitutes an ideal society. So instead of the government dictating, it's you're creating a perfect society by inner reflection. Okay. All right. So now we move forward another decade. So there's another genre of science fiction known as alternative history. So I guess very relevant to this group, which basically imagines what ifs of history. So how would the world have turned out if some event had happened differently? So Stephen Barnes has written a duology, which has become quite well known. So here the premise is that it's set in an alternate world where it's Africa, which is ascendant, and then it's Europe, which is largely tribal and backwards. The point of divergence is that so one of the African companions of Prophet Muhammad, so he plays a much larger role in Islamic history, and because of that, the African history, and then also European history, it unfolds differently. So the story is set in North Africa, in the country of Bilalistan. So what is now contemporary US and Canada. So there's multiple kingdoms settled by people from Africa. And so in this contemporary world, so there are Muslims, mainly African Muslims, Zulus, Arabs, Aztecs, and even Vikings and Indians who show up. And so the roles between the Africans and the Europeans is reversed. Okay, so again, jumping one more decade. If we look at more contemporary works which are coming out of the Islamic world, and especially from the Arab world after the aftermath of the Arab Spring, it would be fair to say that science fiction, I guess that's also true in the West, but definitely there, it has taken a dark dystopian turn. So for example, so one of the important works, one of the most important works which has come out from the Arab world in sci-fi, and it's also been translated into English, is this sci-fi novel Utopia. which actually describes the near future Egyptian society, which is very dystopian in culture. So the rich live in near perfect conditions, while the rest of the country has, for lack of a better term, devolved into barbarianism. Uh, because of an invention of some super fuel in the US, the oil economy has collapsed. And because of that, Middle Eastern economies in general has collapsed. The middle class has disappeared. And it's a very bleak envisioning of near future Middle East. Another novel which came a few years after that is known as The Queue, which also by an Egyptian author, and that has also been translated into English. It's supposed to be a direct reflection of the failure of the Arab Spring. So it's set in the aftermath of an unspecified event known as the disgraceful event. So it's not specified what it is, but you can tell that it's something similar to the Arab Spring. And you can think of it as it describes a world or a government which is a mixture of Kafkaesque bureaucracy with Orwellian surveillance all around. So the story is centered around this very large queue of people lying against a government office to get their pleas heard, and the line just keeps on growing and growing, and it's now kilometers long, and the whole economy has sprung around, and there's a sense of hopelessness there. And just the manner in which the government treats its people, it's very arbitrary, so you don't know what's going to happen to you. So again, a very bleak representation of the contemporary world. Okay, so to summarize some of the things that I've talked about. So I've specifically talked about science fiction, which is supposed to be about the future. But more often than not, the future is a reflection of the present, of our hopes, of our fears. So just as the past is, the interpretation of the past is always colored by the present, then that's also true for the future. Okay. So before I conclude, so a few things about the Islam and Science Fiction project. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this is something that I've been running for a while. So you can check it out at islamandsci-fi.com. So there are 2 anthologies which have been published, and then hopefully another one coming out next year. And then with that, so I want to use the last half hour, so mainly around questions.
Sure. Well, thank you first of all for this presentation. I appreciate it. It was interesting how you had mentioned that most of the writers write sci-fi for almost like for independence or breaking out of the current situation. There was this French writer, Jules Verne, I don't know if you know, who wrote Captain Nemo, regarding the captain that lived in India, to be exact, Bundelkhand, India, and basically had this submarine that saved, that was supplying Sipahi all this, provisions for them to fight English to break. That was in 19th century, unheard of. To have a submarine that could almost never be detected and almost, I mean, right now it's obviously not a big deal, but it's almost like having an iPhone in the 19th century. So it was a sci-fi when he was writing it at the time. So it's an interesting aspect to understand how the oppressed people are looking. You said you mentioned Arab Spring and all that stuff, looking to break out through sci-fi into that world. What do you think about that? Is that a good observation or so in regard?
Yeah, so we are seeing some of that especially in the last few years, literature which is coming out in the last few years. That said, I would say one problem, and I guess I can say that it's a problem with science fiction over the last few decades, is that it has especially the really good sci-fi, it has taken a decidedly dystopian turn. So like we see that, in terms of like some of the most well-known and works of sci-fi which are coming out, they are cyberpunk slash dystopian in nature, and that's also is reflected in a lot of sci-fi which has come out and coming out from the Arab world and beyond. But that said, it is changing. So especially with the success of, I mentioned, Afrofuturism. So that's another genre where mainly people from Africa or African descent, they are uh, envisioning Africa's past and even future in more positive terms beyond just the regular tropes that people are familiar with. So I would say in general, people are taking inspiration even beyond Afrofuturism, taking inspirations beyond that.
Interesting. All right, I guess we'll open up for questions. Anybody, Greg, anybody has any questions or wanted to add anything? Howard?
No, do these guys have any troubles publishing their stuff? Like Egypt and Iran and stuff that they're pretty authoritarian. They've got censors.
Okay, so as with a lot of other good fiction, what many of these authors do is that they talk about something without actually talking about it. So, for example, I talked about the Q. So the author, she never talks about the Arab Spring or the Egyptian government. She just talks about the disgraceful event, and it's set in an unnamed country. And it just seems that whenever these people are questioned, there's always plausible deniability that, hey, I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about some other country. And just to add to that, I actually have had first-hand experience of how people skirt around these censorship limitations. So I was at a conference in Egypt, in Cairo, and people were discussing government clapdowns, and the event was being recorded, and then the person who made that comment, then she specifically, with a wink towards the other Egyptians in the room, she said, of course, something like that would never happen in Egypt because we are a free country with a free press.
So it sounds like you're relying on the censors to be stupid.
Surprisingly, it works well.
You know, to draw parallels, I originally came from former Soviet Union, and religion and everything else was suppressed as a communist state. So what they did is to repel the state and talk about political issues. There was a children program that was created, and there was this Korean Soviet singer. His name is Julian Kim, who would write children's songs, and people would literally read between the lines of him repelling against the government, and they would be publishing on like all this, children magazines, and it would be children TV programs. But people knew he was rebelling against the government, but there's no other way to do it. So that
we have a Zopian language. That's
correct. Remember,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I saw some program in English.
You disappeared, Howard. How are you?
I saw there you go. I saw a thing on a program on English nursery rhymes, and apparently a lot of those are political. Like it was done back 18th, 17th centuries when there are all sorts of authorities you couldn't piss off. You didn't piss off if you knew it was good for you.
Mohammed, I have a question. How many buyers for these books? We're talking about contemporary books, obviously. Are they commercially successful? If you know, of course. I don't know how it could be known, but
That's actually a really good question. Actually, I mean, with respect to the numbers, I'm not sure. That said, there are certain books which have become popular. Um, so one is, yeah, so the two that I mentioned, uh, so the Q and also Utopia,
Mhm.
it has also won awards in the Arab world.
Mhm.
There's one more novel which, in retrospect, I should have mentioned. Okay, I'm just going to see if I can turn on my camera. So just 1 minute.
Sure.
Okay.
All right, are you folks able to see me now?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yep.
All right, excellent. Yeah, there's one more novel which has gained popular. Again, unfortunately, I don't have the numbers, but which has gained a lot of popularity. It's Frankenstein in Baghdad.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so the premise, it's by I think it's by Ahmad Tawfiq. Yeah, so the premise is very interesting. So the story reimagines the tale of Frankenstein, but set in contemporary Iraq after the U.S. invasion. So the doctor who creates the Frankenstein monster, it actually gets different body parts from people who died in, let's say, in suicide bombings or attacks from the U.S. And so he creates the Frankenstein monster, and then when it gets animated, it sets a goal for itself, which is to avenge the lives of all the people which constitute its different parts. And so, unlike the original, it's supposed to be also a commentary on sectarian and religious violence in Iraq, as well as the U.S. invasion. It's very interesting take on Frankenstein.
And
That sounds.
it's been popular, right? It's being bought. And he is acknowledged as a kind of, I don't know is there any measurement of popularity, like some kind of book list or something
Yeah,
like
so
that?
there are
Like
certain
awards,
awards.
some kind of awards.
Yeah,
Like
so there
Booker
are
Prize.
yeah, so there are certain awards in the Arab world, and so both Utopia and Frankenstein in Baghdad, so both of them have received certain awards.
Okay. Was
Yeah.
was there any were there any movies based on those books? Do you know?
Unfortunately, no. So there are not that many movies with sci-fi themes which has come out of the Islamic world. There was one television series which were announced by UAE. It's based on a young adult novel by an Emirati author. That was like 4 or 5 years ago. It never got made.
Mhm.
There's a lot of sci-fi movies that are, basically produced in Pakistan. There's this movie, Indestructible, I remember that. Uh, I mean, he's using the Quran, I guess, to almost like what you mentioned, use this special powers. It's almost like a Pakistani Bollywood movie, so to speak, because there is a lot of mimicking going on back and forth between Pakistan and India as far as the movie filming and stuff going on. I think its name is Indestructible. It's a sci-fi movie based on the religion. The guy has special powers and therefore goes on and destroys, bad forces and stuff like that. So there's
Yes, but yeah, I guess the main limitation is that okay, so I'm from Pakistan, so I can say this. The quality of the movies is not that great. Um, like one that comes to my mind is, and it makes you wonder what were they thinking. So there was a movie that came out in the 1980s. The premise, so the main character is actually the son of Hitler.
Oh God.
Here's the really interesting twist. The movie has nothing to do with anti-Semitism or Germans or anything. Again, it's like, okay, how did they come up with this? So the premise is that Hitler escapes, and then he assassination and ends up in India, and then he marries a local woman, and then he dies anonymously. and then his son, because he grew up with good people, so it's also some nature versus nurture going on. So he's actually a good guy, and then there's just like a lot of Bollywood movies, there's some gang of people who are making trouble, and so Hitler's son goes and he rescues the damsel in distress and saves the day.
It's not as weird as it sounds. I think most of Hitler's close family made it up to the United States in the period prior to World War II.
Long Island, yeah, Long Island.
And there was some question as to whether or not it was good for them to have kids.
They were living right next to Albert Einstein,
Yeah.
who was thrown out of Germany because he called him what do you call him, a Jewish pig? And
Yeah.
and he's the smartest person of 20th century.
Yeah. So just actually, your description of Frankenstein in Iraq sounds a lot like the Golem, which is an old ancient Jewish story.
A Golem, yeah.
Mhm.
So which countries do you think, a Muslim country would you think leading in this genre? I mean, cultural leader, in this genre nowadays? What do you think?
So with countries, it's difficult to say because there's some good stuff which has come out over the last couple of decades, but in terms of the total volume, it's not as much, I would say. And that said, we can talk about languages.
The most of the Muslim probably don't even speak Arabic, right?
Right. Yeah. So in Arabic, I would say a lot of good stuff has been coming out lately. Beyond that, in Turkey, from Turkey, you occasionally see some really good writings and novels come out.
We have a guy here, Ken. Do you know of any novels, sci-fi novels that come out of Turkey? He's from Turkey.
That's a good question. There's a lot of political ones, but I can't say I came across like a world quality sci-fi novel. I think they're more about human beings and their current statuses and history, not so much sci-fi, from my experience at least.
Nobody like Orhan Pamuk.
Yeah, he doesn't
know.
Yeah, he doesn't do sci-fi though, does he?
I know, no. He is philosophical, psychological. I mean, I like him a lot.
He's good.
Yeah. So no one of that caliber. That said, I would say in the English-speaking world, it's mainly people from the diaspora, from the Muslim world, and also converts. So they are writing some interesting works.
I have a quick historical question, and I'm not related to sci-fi, but Mohammed, when there was a conquest, or Arabic conquest of the Middle East and a lot of the Greek towns and Roman towns, how was the different religious books was written, in what language, when the integration happened? Do you know any of this? Like for example, was there any version of let's say Bible that was written, I know in Andalus there was Bible that was written in Arabic, but was there any kind of Greek translation of Quran or any of that stuff, or in that 700, 800?
It's forbidden to translate it.
Okay, well,
I mean, Turks got dispensation, but that was much later.
Okay, so first I will answer the translation question.
Yeah.
Okay, just give me 1 minute. Kids? Okay, so first the translation question. So the first known, at least something which is mentioned in historical records, and of course we don't have the translation itself, of the Quran is actually in the Sindhi language, which is in South Asia and contemporary Pakistan. So that was actually done in the 8th, sometime in the middle of the 8th century. So they are antecedents.
But was it, because from what I remember, it was considered to be not proper to translate Arabic. You were supposed to read it in Arabic, even if you don't understand it.
I'm here in Toronto, and I've walked down the main street and seen guys out there selling copies of the Quran. As far as I can see, they're in English.
I'm talking about earlier. I mean,
Oh,
now
hmm.
it's all translated in all kinds of languages.
Okay, so like with many other things in history, so this taboo against translation, it developed much later. So it's okay. So think of the following. So like if you go and talk to any, let's say, an average Muslim, let's say on the street of Cairo or Istanbul or Lahore, and if you ask them that are non-Muslims allowed in Mecca, they'll say, of course not, and they've never been allowed. But this complete prohibition did not develop until the middle of the Crusades. So like even 100 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad, we do have contemporary accounts of Jews, Christians, and even atheists who lived in Mecca and Medina.
But nowadays, any Muslims can travel to Mecca, right? Or only Arabic?
No, I'm talking about non-Muslims.
Oh, non-Muslims. Oh, non-Muslims.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, traditionally they're not allowed, but things happen. So, because I remember I was reading that when there was a time to translate it into the Turkish language, where Turkey was, created an empire already, it was quite a debate before they allowed this translation.
Yes, and even in so I can talk about British, not even British, Mughal India. So when the first complete translation of the Quran was done, it was first done in much later in the Persian language, because Persian was the language of the Muslim elite. Right. I mean, there was a massive debate, and the person who wanted to translate it, there was like actual physical fights and fatwas against him, but not, 200 years later now he's considered to be a hero even by the same group of clergy who, at least their descendants who were against him. So things change and evolve.
Mohammed, are there recognized version of translation, let's say in Turkish, in English, in Hindu, or any other?
Okay, so here's the interesting part about Islamic scriptures versus other scriptures. So only the Arabic Quran is considered like the Quran with a capital Q. All the translations, they are considered to be interpretations. So that said, certain translations are considered to be closer to the original as compared to others. So my personal opinion is that for English, we need something similar to a committee of people who translated the King James Bible.
Yeah.
I mean, regardless of your theology and your religion, I mean, the choice of words, the language of the King James Bible, I mean, that's a work of art in itself.
Yeah, and it's canonized. So yeah, okay, here is official, recognized by everybody version and so on.
Right. Yeah. So that's why there's only like the Arabic Quran. So that's only canon. Even if you come up with like the near perfect translation, you cannot say that it's canon.
Okay.
I just took a quick look up there.
Howard, you disappeared again.
That said, there's one translation which I somewhat prefer. It's called the Study Quran. So what is unique about that translation is that it has the original Arabic, but it also has translations from 10 different sources.
Oh wow.
So the reason is that it's supposed to give a spectrum of views. So it has translation and some explanations. So an equivalent would be, say, if you had a translation of the Bible with the original, but then you also had, let's say, the Catholic perspective, the Orthodox perspective, the Lutheran perspective, and the Mormon perspective, all of these side by side. So that's one unique thing about that translation. Not recommended for beginners, but
I Yeah, we worry about translation. I just took a quick look for Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses. He's got horns. And apparently this comes from a mistranslation of an original Hebrew Bible.
Hmm.
Interesting.
So this can be, I presume, maybe they got it right in the King James. I'll have to look it up.
Right. I just yeah, okay. I just remembered there were two parts to the question regarding translation. So the question that Zakar asked, what was I forgot what was the first part.
Right. The first question I was saying, well, when Spain was taken over,
Yes,
there was a translation of Bible in Arabic because it was easier to get educated in Arabic at that time, even if you're a Christian, than in Latin because it wasn't available everywhere. But Arabic was very easily available to the Christians, even the ones that didn't even convert to Muslim religion. So they read Bible in the Arabic. So the New Testament, I meant, apologize, not. And therefore, I was just looking to see if there was any kind of cross-pollination of that the other way around. And like you clarified that, obviously in earlier versions there was, but it's just that I was just found it interesting in Andalusia that there was this, because of education piece, because Arabic was available to so many people got more educated in Christian religion through Arabic language, so to speak. So it was interesting.
Yeah. So another equivalent of that would be, I guess you can even say even contemporary Egypt. So for the last 500-600 years, the Coptic Christians, they have been reading Arabic. So the original language Coptic, that's mainly for religious services and whatnot. The other thing is that Arabic as a language, it was, in the early Islamic Empire for the last 100 years or so, it was the language of the ruling elite,
right?
But not necessarily the language of administration. So in
I
Persia, the language of administration for, I want to say 70, don't quote me on this number, but I want to say for 70, 80 years, it was still the Pahlavi language, and then in the
you're talking about script, right? The Pahlavi script.
No, I'm talking about the Persian language before it became Arabized.
No, but the language is still Persian. The script was Pahlavi, right? And then it became Arabic script that they started to write Persian language in Arabic script. That's how it is right now. But the language, maybe it was influenced by Arabic language, but it was not like it's still Persian language even nowadays, right?
No, I guess what I meant was that even after the Arab conquest, the language of administration was not Arabic.
Right.
For 70, 80 years, it was still Persian.
Right. Even for Seljuks, it was Persian. When Seljuks took over, and it went
right. But by that time, it had been Arabized. But I guess what I meant was that even the script itself, it was not Arabic for the longest time.
Right. Okay. Wow.
And then the same goes for the other parts of the Middle East that the Arabs conquered. They used whatever the local administrative language was. So Arabic gained prestige much later. I would say in the 2nd century of Islamic conquest.
Oh, I see.
So it was not from the get-go that things were like that.
Interesting. Wow. So it's a Semitic part of language, right? But that was developed. Arabic was developed from the family of the Semitic languages, right? And then, is that okay? Just wanted to, because they look so dissimilar from all the other ones. You look at a lot of Semitic language, Aramaic, and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah. The other thing is that the Arabic, or what we recognize as the Arabic script with the circles and whatnot. Yeah. So that the earliest Arabic script, and definitely at the time of the inception of Islam, it's somewhat different. I can read it, I can recognize words, but it's a lot of straight lines, more like Latin. And actually, if you get a chance, I can actually share some links. It actually looks very contemporary.
Oh, really? That's pretty cool. Listen, Mohammed, we always welcome you back. We have so many questions. We're a very curious group here. I know that you said that up until December you're busy, and but you're always welcome. Even drop by, to add something, or we're so interested in it, mesmerized. When we do this Islamic, segment, like I've showed you, like we started from the, Muhammad all the way to, we're probably going to develop it, all the way to 19th, 20th century. And it's going to be probably going through like the whole year. And we're doing crusades right now, second, third crusade, and we're going to do Mamluks and Khwarezmian kingdom, with al-Bukhari and all that stuff. So should be an interesting episode. Whenever you want to drop by, always would like to have you set us straight, or or give us guidance, or maybe even ask a question or two, and or add certain things, and we'd really appreciate it. This is really good. I guess last question I have. Last time when we're talking about Vikings, when in Viking world, how come there was all this Baghdad coins that were found, or as the archaeological discoveries, in Viking lands? Was there a predominant trade between Viking and Baghdad and Damascus at the time, or how did they trade?
So based on what I've read, there seem to be 3 different trade routes. So one is via Andalus to Europe. The second one was via the Byzantine Empire.
Okay.
And then the third one, which was directly the Vikings and the Arabs, was along the Volga River. And for some time, the Vikings were one of the main sources of slaves, or basically the Vikings supplied slaves to the Arabs, mainly Slavs.
Did they Vikings got to the Volga River? I thought it was Dnieper. I thought, but like Volga is a bit too far for them.
All the way down to the Byzantines. Well, what we know
Yeah,
about
but you don't need the
funerals-
Volga River falls into the Caspian
He's
Sea.
about Bulgars, right? Bulgars. There was a trade between Volga.
Yeah,
Bulgars.
the Bulgars. Yeah, I understand, but
But the reason Caspian
but
Sea
they
are
were
good, you can get
also,
to-
but the Bulgars were also Muslim, right?
Correct.
Yes.
But if you reach the Caspian Sea, you're good. I mean, a lot of what we know about Viking funerals comes from an Arab writer who visited them. So the place is accessible.
No, Arabs were there. I was just wondering if Vikings reached Volga, but that I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's even an account of Vikings raiding the Caspian.
Really? Oh, interesting.
I can actually find it. I can share that with the group.
Never heard of it, but it sounds totally credible.
That's interesting. And how did
They would have to drag their ships. I mean, but it's very far. I mean,
No, you build a new ship. They know how to build ships.
no, I mean they would have to drag it between the rivers. How do they get to Volga? They had to.
No, you go to the appropriate river and then you chop down some trees and build a ship.
Oh no.
Usually
It's along. Usually they did drag the ships from one river to another if it's short distance.
Right.
I've done canoe trips. Portage and canoes is easy. I'm not throwing portage a 60-foot dragon boat.
Yeah. No. They did it. They created slates and sometimes with the wheels, and they did drag the ships.
How Oleg was able to, or Ikor was able to attack the Byzantium, or the whole Tsar city in Russian.
Okay, so yeah, so the reference that I have is someone by the name of Ingvar the Far-Traveled. So it says, was a Swedish Viking who led a large attack against the Seljuks from 1036 to 1042.
Oh, wow, that's much later. That's not the Ingvar from the Viking series. That's the boneless. That's the different Ingvar.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
so you mean Seljuks? That's before they went into Asia and Anatolia, right? That's when they were in Middle Asia, right? So that's
But-
why that would make sense for them to go into Caspian.
So 1036. So that's like literally the beginning of the
Yeah,
Seljuk
that
Empire.
that's the very beginning of the invasion of Anatolia, right?
Yes.
I'm just looking at something else here. In 1679, Sieur de Laval was exploring up around Lake Superior, and they stopped and built a ship.
Oh wow.
It got sunk.
Right.
I don't know how bad the Caspian is for storms and stuff like that. So a bunch of guys, you're assuming that a bunch of guys out in the wilderness can't build a ship, and people weren't as specialized in as they are now. They know something about everything.
Yeah,
And
well,
maybe it would turn out the ships weren't very well made and they weren't seaworthy, but still.
That's interesting.
yeah, but usually they traveled with a ship. I'm sure that
Alright,
maybe sometimes they could. Yeah.
I just want to let Mohammed, I want to thank him first of all for this incredible presentation. And like I said, you're always welcome. You're a friend and family. Let us know whenever you want to, do another one, or no pressure, or if you want to drop by and one of our series and have a discussion or just talk about it. We really appreciate coming in today, and I hope we have the rest of the weekend off, and everybody have a nice. See you on Sunday, guys. I mean, Saturday.
Thanks a lot.
All right.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you, Mohammed. Very interesting.
Appreciate it. Nice weird
care.
subject.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye.
All right. Take care, folks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye.